Today, we're tackling some foundational stuff. Immanuel Kant and the philosophy he kicked off, German Idealism. Our guide is Dennis Schulting's book, Apperception and Self-Consciousness in Kant and German Idealism. It really digs into how self-awareness, being aware of ourselves, became so crucial for Kant.
And how that whole idea then influenced, well, a lot of thinkers after him.
Exactly.
Okay, Kant, German Idealism. Sounds heavy, maybe a little intimidating.
It can be.
But think about it like this. How do we go from just seeing something, like a tree, to actually understanding, okay, that's a tree, it's separate from me, what's happening in our minds there?
That's the kind of fundamental question we're getting into. The plan is to break down the introduction and each chapter.
Giving you a clear picture of Schulting's take on Kant's philosophy.
Right. It's a critical look, focusing especially on apperception.
Apperception. Okay, that sounds technical. What's the core idea there?
It essentially means self-consciousness, that inner sense of I. Schulting argues it's absolutely central to Kant's whole philosophical project.
Okay, central. And the book also looks at how this idea influenced later thinkers?
Yeah, the German idealists who followed Kant, people like Hegel, Fichte. Schulting uses a wide range of Kant's own works, too.
Like the critique of pure reason, obviously, but also things like the groundwork on ethics, the prolegomena.
He draws connections across Kant's system.
Now, to really get why Kant was such a big deal, we probably need to talk about his Copernican turn, right?
Definitely. That's fundamental. Before Kant, the standard view was, well, that our minds had to somehow match up with reality to understand it.
Our thoughts conform to objects.
Right. Kant just flipped that. He proposed, what if it's the other way around? What if the world we experience has to conform to how our minds are structured?
Wow. Okay, that's a huge shift.
It is. It puts self-consciousness apperception right at the heart of how we can even make sense of those big metaphysical questions about reality.
So before Kant, metaphysics, was it kind of like the Wild West, philosophers just throwing out theories without a clear way to test them? Is that fair?
That's actually a pretty good analogy. Kant saw this lack of a solid universal standard for evaluating metaphysical claims as a major problem.
Which motivated his whole project.
That's why he did this deep dive into the nature of human understanding itself. He figured if we understand how our minds work, we can find a reliable basis for judging those big claims.
So the book's intro really hammers this home. Self-consciousness is key to Kant's critique of metaphysics.
It highlights the Copernican turn, this thought experiment. What if objects conform to us, to our forms of sensing and understanding?
The big insight being that we become the starting point for understanding reality.
And the motivation, as we said, was the lack of that universal standard before him. The intro also clarifies that Kant's critique isn't about looking out there, it's more an inner reflection.
A look at the limits and capabilities of reason itself when it comes to knowledge. Okay, so moving into chapter 2, Kant's Copernican revolution, Schulting really digs into this idea, doesn't he?
He does. Kant himself called his work Copernican, especially in the B preface of the critique. Schulting draws out some really specific, systematic parallels between Kant's revolution in metaphysics and Copernicus's in astronomy.
Now, usually when we hear Copernican revolution applied to Kant, we might think it's just, a fancy metaphor for something radically new.
Yeah, a lot of people assume that, but Schulting argues it's much deeper. It's not just figurative.
So how is it deeper?
It gets at the reasons behind their hypotheses, Kant's and Copernicus's, and the profound shifts in thinking they caused. Understanding this revolution in the way of thinking, as Kant put it, is key to grasping the centrality of the subject in his philosophy.
And it helps clarify Transcendental Idealism.
Yes, absolutely. The chapter also looks at why interpreting Kant's Copernicanism as simple perspectivism is a mistake.
Okay.
And Schulting outlines Kant's overall strategy in the critique, explaining the transcendental turn. He even gives a quick rundown of Copernicus's own revolution for context.
And then ties it all back to show how Kant's move in metaphysics is typically Copernican.
Right. Schulting points to Kant's own language phrases like, just like, in a similar way, even an explicit footnote about an analogical relation. That suggests Kant meant it seriously.
Interesting. And Schulting addresses the debate about this. Some scholars weren't convinced.
Yeah, there was an older debate, particularly in Anglophone literature. Hansen, for example, claimed it had nothing whatever to do with Copernicus.
But Schulting disagrees strongly.
He does. He points out Kant himself talks about a revolution in the sciences modeling the one needed in metaphysics. Kant even mentions implicitly how Copernicus's model improved calculations of planetary movements.
So the analogy isn't just superficial, it points to a method.
A rational reconstructive strategy, kind of mirroring the hypothetico-deductive method you see in empirical science, like Bacon's approach.
And this isn't just about how we know things, it's also metaphysics itself. It changes how we see reality.
Definitely, it impacts the relationship between how we know, ratio cognoscendi, and how things are, ratio cendi.
Yeah.
This leads directly into Kant's idealism.
And that famous line about ontology giving way to a mere analytic of the pure understanding.
Right. Schulting explains Kant is basically redefining ontology, focusing on the fundamental features of being as given to us in sensible experience.
Okay, then the thought experiment from the B preface. Compare assuming cognition conforms to objects versus objects conforming to cognition.
Yes. Schulting explains why that second assumption, objects conforming to us, is what makes a priori knowledge, knowledge independent of experience, possible in the first place.
It has more explanatory power, avoids contradiction.
It leads to the transcendental turn, taking the thing such that it conforms to thought. This establishes that necessary link between the conditions for something being an object for us and the conditions of our own thought.
Making a priori knowledge possible.
If objects conform to our a priori concepts in our pure intuition space and time, then that one-to-one relation between necessary concepts and the forms of the empirical object becomes possible.
So the Copernican part is the increased rationality, the more secure knowledge it allows. Like Copernicus made astronomy more secure.
Though Schulting reminds us the preface argument is hypothetical. The main body of the critique needs to provide the rigorous apodictic proof from our constitution, space-time concepts.
Right. Okay, so after establishing this Copernican framework, Chapter 3 looks back. The Wolfian background to Kant's concept of apperception.
That's right. It explores the historical roots, especially in Leibniz and Wolff.
What was the issue with their views on consciousness?
Well, Schulting points out they often kind of blurred the lines, conflated the epistemic meaning, consciousness related to knowledge, with the psychological meaning, just feeling aware.
And Kant was wrestling with apperception early on, but the term transcendental apperception is specifically his from the critical period.
Correct. It's a technical term he coined. And crucially, Kant distinguished inner sense empirical apperception from apperception as logical, formal self-consciousness. His predecessors tended to equate inner sense with self-consciousness.
That sounds like a key distinction.
It is. Schulting notes, Kant himself sometimes uses consciousness loosely in the first critique, the A edition, when he really means this deeper transcendental apperception.
Which caused confusion later.
It did. Early commentators like Reinhold sometimes took Kant's principle of apperception as being about mere psychological awareness, not the fundamental principle of knowledge Kant intended. Kant explicitly separates transcendental conditions from psychological ones.
So when reading Kant's lectures, we should often read consciousness as apperception.
Schulting argues yes. Often it should be read as apperception or unity of consciousness in that specific critical sense.
The chapter also covers the view that obscure representations, things we're barely aware of, were seen as unconscious by Leibniz and Wolff.
Yes, a view Kant initially shared but later revised. In works like The Inquiry, he argued consciousness is ambiguous. Not being aware of having a representation isn't the same as being totally unconscious of it.
So even obscure representations might involve some degree of consciousness, like the soul feeling the representation.
That's the idea from the metaphysic Herder. And later, influenced by Leibniz's law of continuity, Kant argued in the B edition critique that consciousness exists on a spectrum, infinite degrees between full clarity and total unconsciousness.
Okay, so consciousness becomes more clearly tied to epistemology, to knowledge, in later lectures.
Linked to the unity of representations in a judgment, the relation to an object. In the metaphysic Vigilantius, it's even called a logical function.
And Schulting finds traces of this thinking earlier in notes from the 1770s, linking the unified subject to rules.
The Duisburger Nachlass. Even though the term apperception isn't prominent in the Metaphysic L1 lectures, it appears strongly in the Metaphysic Rongovius lectures, likely because Kant started using it after publishing the critique.
And Kant clarifies apperception isn't a sense, but how we're aware of representations from both outer and inner senses.
Yes, in a note from around 1783-84, the chapter concludes by linking this back to the Wolfian idea of apperception as representation of one's representations.
That reflexive quality.
Right, showing that reciprocal relationship between the subject and its objects, grounded in consciousness and the capacity to judge according to rules.
Which leads us nicely into Chapter 4. Apperception and the Transcendental Unity of Self-Consciousness. This dives right into the core concept.
It does. Schulting emphasizes Kant's point. Apperception isn't mainly about feeling self-aware, it's the very foundation for objective knowledge.
Right, like Kant says in the paralogisms, we can't grasp some abstract self separate from our thoughts. Trying to pin down that underlying identity just leads you in circles.
This brings us to the analytic principle PTA. Basically, a representation belongs to me if and only if it's analytically connected with all my other representations that also belong to me, under some condition that combines them.
Okay, and that condition for combining them is?
A priori synthesis, that fundamental act of the mind putting things together before experience. Schulting explains that this a priori synthesis is the ground, the explanation, for the PTA.
So the thoroughgoing identity of apperception, the sense that all my experiences are mine, is made possible by this a priori synthesis, the original synthetic unity of apperception.
For Kant, my identity as a thinker isn't just given, it's established by a spontaneous act of unifying my representations, the I think.
And this, I think, isn't from the senses, it's an act of spontaneity from the understanding.
Correct. It's spontaneous, original, but it rests on that a priori synthesis, the transcendental unity of self-consciousness. That unity holds together all the representations accompanied by the I think.
So spontaneity and being grounded in synthesis aren't contradictory.
No. Schulting clarifies they're equiprimordial, two sides of the same coin. The a priori synthetic unity is the logical ground for the identity of apperception. It enables apperception in the very act.
So self-identity is the act of unifying representations through synthesis into this transcendental unity.
Yes. And Schulting stresses the reciprocity between the analytic unity, the indexical I, and the synthetic unity. The I is only possible because we presuppose some underlying synthesis bringing experiences together.
This connects the I of I know and the I of I do something. Epistemic self-consciousness constitutes self-consciousness itself.
Right. And it's not based on some direct intuition of ourselves, but the spontaneous act establishing the identity of the consciousness in these representations.
But we don't have intellectual intuition, right? No direct, non-sensory knowing of ourselves.
Correct. So we can't just grasp our identity a priori. We need to combine representations we get through empirical intuition, through our senses, to become aware of our self-identity.
And the synthesis affects our inner sense, our awareness of our mental states.
Yes, it's the unity of the action the understanding is conscious of. Our self-intuition is empirical, and the internal affection is the understanding determining this inner sense, not some separate psychological feeling.
And we don't have another intuition of that determining act itself.
No. Kant says we can't determine our existence as a self-active being directly. We just represent the spontaneity of our thought. This rejects ideas like Fichte's Selbstentscheidung, that direct intellectual self-intuition.
So Kantian self-knowledge is about the relation between the determining act of apperception and the sensible intuition determined by it, giving us knowledge only of ourselves as appearance.
Exactly, resting on the analytic unity of apperception. And Schulting clarifies later why just being aware of this identity isn't full self-knowledge yet. The affection of inner sense is also needed.
Fascinating. Okay, Chapter 5 moves to reflexivity, intentionality, and animal perception. This sounds like a tricky area for Kant. Can animals perceive objects like we do?
It is tricky. This chapter connects directly to Kant's concept of an object and the necessary reflexivity involved. Kant thought apperception representing oneself as an I is unique to beings like us.
Implying animals don't apperceive their representations.
That's the implication. Early Kant even seemed to deny animals' inner sense. But Schulting warns against misreading this as meaning animals have no consciousness at all.
Because transcendental apperception isn't the same as basic consciousness.
Right. It's neither necessary nor sufficient for it. And science suggests many animals are conscious. Some even have bodily self-awareness. The problem is, if animals lack apperception, do they lack awareness of objects entirely? That seems counterintuitive.
How does Schulting navigate this?
He uses Gottlieb's distinction between different senses of objectivity and notes Kant himself could be loose with the term object. But the core argument is objectivity in the strict Kantian sense is constituted only by the unity of apperception.
That's from the transcendental deduction.
Yes. So merely subjectively valid representations like animal perceptions don't count as objective in that strict sense, even if they involve being affected by things and responding behaviorally.
What about spatial awareness? Can animals be aware of space without distinguishing object from self?
Schulting suggests, yes, they might have spatial phenomenology, without that strict subject-object distinction. This is where he differs slightly from Gottlieb. For Kant, objective intentionality requires transitive consciousness awareness of an object as distinct from oneself.
Which animals lack?
According to this reading, yes. Though they have intransitive creature consciousness and are aware of objects through sensory affection, Schulting likens animal body awareness perhaps to Sartre's non-reoccurrent consciousness of the body.
But animals can make distinctions, right? Like a stall and a door.
They can make physical distinctions, yes, but Kant would say they lack the self-awareness to recognize the differentiating as their own act. It's not logical differentiating based on understanding. Schulting disagrees with Gottlieb here, arguing apperception and reflexive self-awareness can't be decoupled from judgment which animals lack.
So their differentiation is more like empirical tracking.
Kind of. Tracking spatially arrayed objects without awareness of doing the tracking, which requires recognizing generic properties or marks linked to imagination and concepts, which animals seem to lack.
Schulting defends Kant against charges of being too human-centric here.
He does, arguing the transcendental perspective is about the conditions for our cognition of objects, a universal validity regarding possibility, not dependent on humans being present.
He also touches on non-conceptualism, space not needing the understanding.
Right, the idea that determinate space, defined by human understanding, is conditional, distinct from a more basic metaphysical space.
And the immediacy of animal intuition.
Without apperception and categories, the object is categorially indeterminate. There's no strict me or subject-object split in the Kantian sense. The relation is immediate but indistinct due to lacking conceptual mediation.
Though the object still has boundaries and follows laws.
Yes, animals are spatially oriented. But Schulting insists true objective intentionality only happens at the transcendental level, distinct from animal spatial awareness.
Okay, that clarifies a lot. Chapter 6, Kant's Transcendental Idealism. Always a contentious topic. How does Schulting approach appearances as representations?
He addresses interpretations like Van Cleve's, suggesting phenomenalism might be the only non-deflationary way to read Kant here, explaining how self-consciousness conditions suffice for objectivity given sensory input. He also touches on the appearance thing in itself relation.
And the old criticism about applying causality to things in themselves.
Right, from Jacobi onwards. Schulting acknowledges a fundamental dependence of appearances on things in themselves as ground, even if the specific causal relation is complex. Kant's view. Appearances don't exist transcendentally outside our thoughts. Things in themselves do. Appearances being mind-dependent can't be properties of things in themselves.
What about that B164 passage? Appearances exist only relative to the subject.
Schulting rejects simple phenomenalism, empirical idealism, and the view that appearances are mind-dependent properties of things in themselves. He argues relative to the subject means the properties we attribute to objects are wholly dependent on our mode of intuition, the Copernican turn again. They're effectively subject-internal in that sense.
So appearances can't be properties of things in themselves because space itself, the condition for outer objects, is, in us, a form of intuition.
Schulting then brings in Reinhold's view of the determinate object, either the thing in itself or the object determining consciousness. Reinhold seemed to deny a determinate object existing as a thing in itself, independent of the subject.
Seeing the Gegenstand, the object, as the sum of properties connected in intuition?
Yes, similar to Kant. But Reinhold appeared to view the thing in itself as an abstraction, the bare subject left after stripping away all possible experiential properties, a determination, which poses problems for its relation to the actual affecting thing.
Schulting then briefly touches on Fichte and Hegel, inseparability of thought and being.
The idea that any content for thought is a product of the self's structuring activity. Schulting distinguishes this epistemological necessity, how we must make sense of things, from a stronger constitutive claim that the mind creates all content.
Kant's view being that content for us is made relevant by us, not literally produced.
Right. The distinction between content and self is one we make. Schulting references B159 on a priori knowledge via categories, laws of combination, not intuition's form, and clarifies B161 on perception, as relating to unity in intuition via synthesis speciosa, not just raw sensation.
And the connection between perception and understanding is seen from understanding's viewpoint, not perception inherently aiming at concepts.
Correct. It's not like perceptions are trying to become judgments on their own.
Which brings us to German idealism, exploring Kant's legacy, especially Hegel's criticisms.
Yes. Schulting notes Hegelian conceptualists tend to downplay the raw externality of sense content, though admitting it's necessary in some sense. He argues Kant's deduction doesn't erase the sense-thought distinction, but shows the subject taking up sense content as a cognitive constraint.
And warns against confusing epistemic and constitutive levels. Sense content is intelligible by understanding, not constituted by it.
Like with space and time, they aren't products of understanding. Only determinate spaces and times are, via imagination. Schulting introduces Hegel's critique. Kant has a reflective bias, relies on discursive logic, leading to his specific idealism focused on empirical knowledge.
And McDowell's point about space-time being a brute fact for Kant, which Hegel rejects.
Right. McDowell suggests ditching the Transcendental Idealism frame for space-time, though Schulting says Kantians don't have to accept that. Kantian insights valued by Hegel, like the synthetic unity of apperception, get transformed in a framework where reason, not sensation, determines objective validity.
Schulting mentions Pippin on Kant's distinction between general and transcendental logic.
Yes, only transcendental logic considers the relation to objects. Hegel shared Kant's interest in the link between forms of understanding and thinking about objects. Pippin feels Hegel thought Kant didn't go far enough in identifying forms of thought with categories of knowledge.
Schulting clarifies the understanding-imagination intimacy in Kant and how general logic needs content from elsewhere, while transcendental logic has sensibility a priori to give pure concepts matter.
Correct. The distinction shows conceptual analysis alone doesn't reach objects. Transcendental logic connects via sensibility. But this sensory content doesn't determine the understanding. Understanding determines it spontaneously.
And transcendental means cognizing how certain representations are possible or applied a priori.
Yes. Transcendental logic can indicate a priori where pure concepts apply. Synthesis unifies elements into content. When Kant says experience gives matter for concepts, it's a general point. Logic needs experience to connect to objects.
Categories only get objective validity when applied to sensible objects via intuition.
In abstraction, they're just intentional. Schulting notes, Pippin sees Hegel's categories as the very framework of meaning for object reference, aligning somewhat with Kant's formal object concept. But Hegel wants the reason of what is, facing the challenge of how reason alone references reality without pure intuition.
Hegel's idea that the concept produces its own reality, trying to shift focus inward.
Seems so, but still needing to distinguish imagined from real. Hegel's dialectical logic aims for a complete conceptual analysis where nothing remains truly external. He assumes no fundamental gap between pure concepts and pure intuitions like spacetime, seeing the latter as concepts.
Raising the question of instantiation in particular.
Right. Schulting contrasts Kant's more specific analysis of perception with Hegel's global conceptual approach. Hegel sees no initial intuition-concept gap to bridge. While Kant sees no gap between pure concepts and sensibility via pure intuition, Hegel's absolute subject-object identity stresses being's intrinsic intelligibility more overtly.
Schulting then tackles the myth of Kant's psychological subjectivism.
Yes, originating partly with Hegel. The idea that Kant derives reality structure from us, separating thought and being, making categories merely subjective filters. Schulting argues this misrepresents Kant's idealism.
Saying the critique uses objectivity ambiguously, accusing Kant of filtering the world at an epistemological cost.
Schulting contends both the reading of Kant's categories and Hegel's critique are often mistaken. Kant's theory, properly understood, isn't subjective in that bad solipsistic sense. He counters Sedgwick's point by emphasizing Kant's deduction shows how categories do apply to sense content, referring to actual objects, making them necessary conditions for both experience and objects.
So, summarizing Hegel's critique, Kant starts with a blind assumption of discursive logic, a representationalist language, a fixed ego trying to combine with external content, creating an unbridgeable dualism.
That's Hegel's view. A reflective bias from his choice of logic, leading to his specific idealism focused on empirical knowledge, linked back to McDowell's point about space-time as a brute fact Hegel couldn't accept as foundational.
Wow, okay. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into Schulting's Apperception and Self-Consciousness in Kant and German Idealism. We've really covered the intro in each chapter.
Yeah, tracing Kant's concept of apperception, its significance, and its pretty profound influence on what came after.
We've hit on some incredibly rich, complex ideas. The Copernican turn, consciousness, self-consciousness, how objective knowledge is even possible.
The tricky questions around animal perception, the details of transcendental idealism, and then how German idealists like Hegel engaged critically with all of this.
Understanding these core concepts really feels fundamental if you're interested in epistemology, metaphysics, the history of philosophy generally.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on.
Consider this. How might the idea, Kant's core idea, really that the very structure of our experience is shaped by how our minds work? How might that impact how you understand the world and maybe your place in it?
Yeah, like are there aspects of reality that might be more a product of our own cognitive setup than just independent features floating out there in the universe?
It's a deep question.
Definitely something to think about. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, maybe even tackle Kant's original texts or look for other analyses. Continue your own deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive.